Okay. Yeah, I can understand that. And we don't have to stick to the script like super tight.
Oh, that's fine. There's just a couple of things like that I thought at the beginning I'd cover, and after listening, so you're right. You know, the previous lady, she kind of influenced what I was like. Oh, I was like, oh, maybe I do need to kind of explain this other thing that I had not thought about because I think she was from Friends General. Well, we can talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, my take was she didn't come out and say it, but I think she was more of the more liberal wing, I would assume.
Yeah, I think that she is from Friends General Conference. So, and I guess we can talk a little bit about it. I don't know a huge amount about all the schisms and stuff. That's kind of one of the things that um I mean you know the typical evangelical things. People get angry and then they split the church, and then you have two of basically the same church like right down the street from each other, and they don't like each other. So, and I experienced that like when our Baptist church, our Southern Baptist Church in California did that. So then one was El Dorado Hills Baptist Church, and the other one became Church of the Foothills, and they were like just an exit on the freeway away from each other. And then and over very silly things to me at least. I mean, but important to some people, I guess. And we had a very similar situation in our church in Virginia Beach where something happened. It's not really relevant what happened, but to me, it was also kind of a silly thing. And well, it was so the pastor's daughter was gay, and so he allowed her to come sing in the choir because he was like, "Well, look, I feel like she's gone astray, but I want her to be able to come back and be part of this and maybe find Christ again." And some people in the church were not having that, so it caused this big split. And so, but my family had already gone through that in our church in California, and so my dad was like, "I'm not dealing with this again," and so we went and found a different one. And then what's funny is like that other church ended up merging back in with the church that split, and there, I don't know, it's just a lot of that infighting stuff. That was one of the things that attracted me to uh, the Quakers, but then it turns out the Quakers kind of have the same problem. It's just it happens a lot less frequently, and I think that is because of the way decision making is done in Quaker business meeting. So like things there's a lot less opportunity for people to like get extremely butthurt and then like take half of the congregation with them somewhere else, especially because of there's a lot of things. I think it's just structurally, it's just things don't lend themselves to some strong leader pulling a whole bunch of people away. It's because it doesn't. There's not really. I wouldn't say it's leveled, but it's like there's not really any sort of like particular leaders in the group. They sort of emerge based on situation. So it's kind of an I don't know. It's an interesting thing. But that lady that was on last time, I think she's with Friends General Conference. Uh, and I guess if are we already recording? Okay. No, no. I mean, you. No, no I was just saying I want to kind of like explain my understanding of that. So there's a couple of like main branches of Quakers, and there's the liberal branch, the evangelical branch, and then the branch that I'm part of, which is the conservative branch. And then there's some other ones as well. The conservative branch is pretty small. I think there's only a couple of thousand members left. And I think the evangelical and liberal branches are the biggest. So Friends General Conference, I think, is liberal, but they what kind of separates. This is my understanding, and may not be accurate. My understanding is that uh, liberal friends would be more reluctant, I guess, to identify as Christian, and evangelical, but they have unprogrammed worship, whereas the evangelical friends are Christian or would more likely identify as Christian, but they have programmed worship. And conservatives identify as Christians and have unprogrammed worship. So the conservative section, I guess, is more. Um, I think that a common way to describe it would be that it's like a very stripped down version of Christianity. So the emphasis uh, in conservative uh, Quakers is um, everything is subordinate to your relationship with Christ, and that Christ will directly minister to you. That's why we don't have clergy. Is that um, nobody is preaching to you. Your experience can be shared and influence others, um, but the hierarchy of the organization is that we're all equal under God, and but Christ will directly minister to you. So even like the Bible is important and is read, and we do receive information, but the way that that is viewed is that the Bible is those people's experience of God, and that's subordinate to your experience of God. But your experience can be sort of tested against the Bible to make sure that you're receiving uh, divine information, not some sort of bizarre internal ego type stuff or whatever. So, like, I mean, like, if you're sitting there and our worship is silent. So if you're sitting there in silence and you're open to Christ, and then you receive a message, this would be a silly message, but you receive the message that, like, I'm going to punch the person next to me or something like that. Well, you can kind of like test that against the narrative, the biblical narrative, and then the narrative of past friends to go like, well, no, that's probably not what God's telling me. Maybe that's something else. So, uh, that's kind of, I would say that's sort of what like places the conservatives sort of in between the two, is that they do have this sort of connection with the liberal side, in that they still do unprogrammed worship, but they also have this kind of connection with the evangelical side, in that most identify as Christians. But again, there's some don't. I think I've mentioned this on other podcasts before. Is we had one of the reasons that some people don't identify it, or we don't. It's not necessarily a requirement for joining meeting. Is that um, since we don't evangelize, our expression of God is in the way that we live, and that is supposed to attract others. And so if if there's no room for non-believers to attend a meeting, or no room for them to be part of our community, then that excludes them from sharing in the light of Christ. So at my old meeting in Virginia, um, we had Buddhists that came, and atheists, and things like that. And some people who, like, if you talk to them, they would use a lot of Christ-centered language, but they would kind of shirk away from the label of Christian, because they felt that, at least in their communities outside of meeting, um, that had baggage with it that was a turnoff to other people. So they would have a lot of Christ-centered language. They believed in Christ, although again, the perspective of Christ is possibly a little bit different. But uh, that was sort of um, that was just it's just a language thing. I think it's more of like a how they want to express it. Like, I identify as Christian, and that's sort of what I talk, how I talk about it, and I use very Christ-centered language. Like, I mean, like, one of the things that would sort of separate Christ-centered Quakers and non-Christ-centered Quakers is that I say, like, when you're sitting in silence, you're open to hearing Christ minister to you, whereas non-Christ-centered Quakers would maybe say the inner light, or divine inspiration, or something like that. They wouldn't say Christ. So uh, that's kind of a weird thing. And then I thought maybe I took a couple of notes that maybe would be a good, like, a more formal belief structure sort of thing, because it is a little bit it's a little bit informal, so sometimes it's a little bit hard. Is one thing that a lot of Quakers will say is that there isn't you can't really tell somebody what a Quaker is, but you can describe what a Quaker is. Kind of that's one thing that, like, they talk about. So I wrote down a couple of main points. So testimonies are kind of an important thing. So we don't have a dogma. We don't do oaths or anything like that. But we do have sort of these testimonies that are sort of descriptive of lifestyle changes that you're supposed to embody and express to the world. One of them is, I think some of them organize these in a different pattern, and it spells out different words and stuff. But the way that it was taught to me is integrity, peace, simplicity, equality, and community. Those are ways to express your belief. But as I said, like, Quakerism is non-doctrinal, kind of. It does have beliefs and stuff like that, and but the theology is expressed more in narrative form, which is one of the reasons why we read a lot of biographies and journals from other Quakers or from other Christians. Is that, like, that's kind of how we arrive at theology. So it's your own experience of Christ acting in your life, and then reading about how Christ acted in the lives of other people. And that's sort of how you arrive at the sort of this theological perspective, I guess. And it does differ a little bit from individual to individual because it is a very individualistic sect of Christianity, I guess. And then there's some other kind of general beliefs that I think are kind of important. Um, so one of them is that and I've kind of touched on this, is that the Spirit of God um, is active both inside and outside of you, and so you can see Christ act in the world, or God, or whatever you want to describe it as. You can see divinity acting in the world, and you can also feel divinity acting in you if you're willing and open to seeing this happen. Another one is that Christ is imprinted in all humans. Uh, the homeless person, or your enemy, or any of these things, Christ is in everybody, and that's something that's important to try to remember and see. Uh, so that, like, when the way that you treat other people is important, because that's also the way that you're teaching an imprint of Christ. Then Christ will minister to you directly if you're willing to listen. That's one thing that's extremely important for Quakers. The understanding of Christ and God is fostered in a community of believers. So that's one thing too. So one of the reasons why meeting is important is, even though Christ is going to minister to you directly, your understanding of the ministry and your understanding of Christ's action in the world is helped by discussing it with others and being in a community of people who actively believe in this. Um, the continuing revelation is also important, which is basically, we don't believe that God stops speaking to the world at Revelations, that God is continuing to speak to us even today, and also through things that you may not, things that are inspirational to you, a rock song, or for me, writings of Tolstoy were very important to my development as a Christian. So God will speak to you through other things besides just the Bible and then Revelations. It's over. He's still speaking today, and he's still revealing truth in the world, divine truth. Another one is the Bible is a very important resource, but it is those people's experience of God being active in the world. It's not the Word of God. That's kind of another differentiation. And then another belief would be experiencing Christ personally transforms your inner world, but also transforms the way that you interact with the rest of the world. And that's kind of goes back to the testimonies. Those are ways to express this in the world. And then uh, the last one that I took a note on was modeling Christ in your life is more important than espousing beliefs in Christ. So uh, that's one thing. It's also kind of, I'm not really. It's always sort of difficult for me to explain these things, and I'm not sure why. But it's more because this is stuff that I learned when I was a kid too in the Baptist church. These are things that we were told. I just never really, through different things, I felt like that was not really being modeled in the church that I belonged to, in a lot of ways. So modeling Christ in our lives is more important than evangelism, is kind of the way that I always think of it, is that I can go knock on 1,000 doors and invite them to church. And that may be effective in some cases, but I think that, and I'm learning this a lot more just as I interact with other people, especially in the liberty community, is that Quakers and their actions in the world, being against slavery, you know, prison abolition, or just treating prisoners better in the 16 and 1700s, like things like that. Those things last a lot longer, and that sort of narrative force of Christ in the community of Quakers has had a huge impact and influenced a lot of people. Um, and the evangelism, I wouldn't say it's like, I wouldn't say it's fake exactly. It's just that it seems like a different, it's a different thing. It's not it's just, it seems, the story in the Bible where the poor woman came and like put a coin quietly in the offering plate, and the other guy came in and dropped in like a whole bunch of coins and stuff, and it's sort of that is sort of what I like. I the way I kind of think about it is that you can do a lot of evangelism type stuff, and um, it's not always really in alignment with Christ. It's more in alignment with your own ego. And so that's kind of that modeling Christ thing and to some degree I'm doing evangelism here, I guess, but it's the modeling Christ thing is I think a greater impact on the world than espousing beliefs, just saying creeds or the Lord's Prayer before you go to bed, or participating in specific sacraments that are sort of vain motions. I think that that's kind of an emphasis that Quakers have that is, I wouldn't say it's different, but it's very important. So those are the kind of the beliefs notes that I took.
Yeah, I'm thinking out loud here, so I reserve the right to kind of take this back, but it seems like one of my problems with evangelical forms of evangelism tends to be like a lot of evangelical things. I think it's consumeristic, and we don't even realize it. So I think evangelicals tend to view evangelism as more of like an invitation. Not that the gospel isn't an invitation, but it's an invitation to come do what we're doing. It's kind of like, hey, join the party. Um, when I think about the gospel in the New Testament, it's a proclamation of something that is true. And so, in a sense, it is an invitation. Like, if you recognize the truth value of the proclamation, Jesus is Lord, that has implications on what you then do. But it's a proclamation of reality. And oftentimes, it's accompanied by acts of justice. So, um, Jews meeting with Gentiles and being criticized for it. No, hey, Jesus is Lord and he's Lord of the Gentiles too. Or healing of somebody. Hey, Jesus is Lord. And it seems like maybe the Quakers go too far. I don't know, because I would still think that evangelism as proclamation is still very important. And maybe they do, and I'm just misunderstanding. But I think what I like is the merging of evangelicals proclaiming Jesus is Lord, but the Quaker doing that kind of accompanies that, and both of those things seem to go together in my mind.
Yeah, and I think that, so that's one thing that, because I've been a convinced friend probably for 8 years now, and that is one thing that like is a little bit, because I think they do still do the proclaiming, but it's more an actions based thing. So like another example of this that's historical is price tags on items, like so you know what something costs. So Quakers came up with that. And the reason that they did that is because uh, uh, single moms or people that didn't have anybody to help them around the house or things like that could send their kids to a grocer and buy items and know what they cost, rather than what traditionally was done up to that point, which was people haggling for prices. So, and kids would often get ripped off if there was no adult there to kind of do that haggling. So it's things like that where they take some sort of action that is in alignment with the testimonies, and I would say that that would be maybe like the testimony of integrity. So you're being honest in business, and that would kind of cue people uh, into there's something different about this community. So and rather than walking up to somebody and hitting them over the head with the Bible or whatever, you're doing something to transform the world and bring Christ more into the world so that people can see His light and come over that way. Um, and I think that this is through all of the testimonies, and that's why they're called testimonies, I guess, is through all the testimonies. This is some way that you're supposed to communicate or proclaim, like you're saying, um, Christ in a way to transform the world. We're a lot less concerned with, um, and also I think this is because there's a lot of different beliefs about it, but much less concerned with going to heaven or hell, and much more concerned with bringing Christ to the world now, or expressing He's already here. We believe that, but helping to fully express that in the here and now, and transforming the world here and now, rather than uh, saving my soul for something much later. Like it's more of uh, an urgency. There are people now that need Christ. And they do need that to save their soul as well. But there's it's I wouldn't say a better way, but a way of allowing allowing that light to shine into the world. I guess is the way to. I mean, it's we learned it in all the songs and stuff when we were a kid too. Hide under a bushel. No, I'm going to let it shine. Like that's kind of the idea. Is like you've got to let this kind of shine out through action. Um, and this is kind of where was it in the Bible where they said like faith without action is dead. Um, and that's kind of the impetus, I guess, is that like we do believe in Christ and we believe in Christ so much that this is what we want into the world and that this is going to attract people to Christ uh, rather than, telling them they're going to hell if they don't believe. It's more like, no, we're going to help people. And through that help, it's going to transform our lives and transform their lives, I guess.
Okay, so this isn't at all meant to be a disparaging comment because I fight against consequentialism all the time, which ends justify the means because as nonviolence, like you can't I don't think you can look at consequences or the results and say determine the morality or goodness of something. What would you say to somebody who says, all right, so you think that Quakerism is the better way to bring Christ and his real presence in the world. Um, but you compare your numbers to the SBC, doesn't look like it's working.
Yeah, no, and that's I think that's a valid concern. This is one of the reasons why evangelical Quakers exist is because they looked at in the late 1800s and when our numbers are nothing, but the evangelicals they're getting numbers. But I mean, I, I wouldn't even say it's better. I would say that this works for some people, and that this is going to attract some people who telling them they're going to hell would not work. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that some people are going to be receptive to different messages, and this particular branch spoke very very strongly to me, and it was through um, the peace testimony and things like that, which attracted me, and like some things that I saw as contradictions in my old Protestant church. But you're absolutely correct. The numbers of my old Protestant churches in that church started out with 100 people or so, and now it's several hundred people. So it's growing. Um, and I don't pretend to know what's on everybody's heart, but when I go to a conservative meeting or even a liberal meeting, it like I feel the presence of God in silence. So it's it's just a different feeling for me, and it may just be that that is the way that Christ speaks to me. But I think you're correct. I mean, like numbers wise, it's uh, you know, but those small numbers make a huge impact on history, particularly American history. So like that's something that can be shown too, is that through and this is kind of one of the ways that you brought it up in the previous one is that Quakers seem to be ahead of their time, and I think they are in a lot of ways. But I think it's particular Quakers are ahead of their time, and that they kind of help bring the rest of the Quakers with them, and that maybe through the way that meeting is organized and the way that the beliefs are structured, it encourages individual action, which sort of prevents people from deferring to the larger hierarchical body and saying, oh, well, somebody will take care of this because it's right. It's they go, no, this is important and I'll take care of it now. And I think that does make a big impact in history. But as far as numbers go, yeah, I mean, it's just, there's just not that many. And I think it's just sitting quietly for a couple of hours every Sunday is not really attractive to a lot of people, but singing and dancing and praise and worship music and a really good sermon and stuff like that is very attractive to a lot of people. So it's just it's a different thing.
All right, so that was kind of like a fire hose of information, good information. I want to try to because we're in a season on nonviolent action right now, and which is what kind of got me interested in Quakers. They come up all the time. I mean, in history, like you said, they're at the right moments. So I want to kind of tie some of the information that you said more into a bigger ideas and real world applications and see if you can kind of unwrap like what's at play in these things. So first, like I said, abolition, Japanese internment camps, civil rights, helping the Jews in France when we're talking about Nazi Germany on the rise. Um, it's like Quakers were everywhere. Like what what gives Quakers the prophetic vision, or the ability to see what most other Christians aren't aren't seeing at that time. Um, and I understand. I've come to understand that it's not Quakers as a whole, right? Benjamin Lay was an outlier, but they're able to produce those big names, and like you said, they do come around more quickly as well. So like what tools do you have that gives your community that prophetic vision?
So I think it's, I mean, it's a really good question. Like the questions you sent me I had to think a lot about them because it is an interesting thing to think of. And I think what a lot of it comes down to is um, the way meeting is structured and um, I think it's the way that meeting is structured and the way that individual action is kind of emphasized. So there, there's something. Conservatives call it harmony. I think it's consensus is sort of the more modern way of describing it, and I think other meetings describe it more as consensus. But it's that decision making is very very slow in meeting, and so using the kind of collective power of the meeting to do something is sometimes very slow and very difficult. But if you feel that Christ is um, pushing something very important on you, uh, that is giving you sort of a fire in your gut or whatever to move forward independently. And I think that's kind of that structure. I think really encourages people to move forward, and then other people they can also gather people in the meeting that also feel that way, um, and kind of move forward. And I think that's one reason why things like this actually get going. Whereas in the a traditional sort of hierarchical structure of a Christian church, um, there's there's a tendency for things to get pushed up and then tabled. And so, whereas I think that there's probably tons of Baptists and Catholics and all that sort of stuff that were opposed to slavery at the same time as many Quakers, I think that Quakers, because of the way that the meeting is structured, took individual action more quickly, and then that individual action impressed upon the hearts of other people. And when you're sitting quietly for a long time and somebody's telling you, you're supposed to see Christ in all other human beings, and you're beating your slave, like that kind of, I think, will tend to work on your conscience when you're quietly thinking about it for several hours a week. And I think that might be one reason why this sort of stuff moves forward in Quakerism a little bit faster. And as far as it being like giving them prophetic vision, I think it's also because you're sitting quietly listening for Christ. That's the whole point of our worship, is that you're trying to hear God. You know the the still small voice is what it is that Christ is not necessarily in all of these big rambunctious things. It's that sitting quietly and expecting that he is going to talk to you, um, kind of opens you up to hearing these things. That's sort of how I interpret it. I took a couple of notes on that question actually. So one thing I wanted to point out, I don't feel, I always feel bad about this, is that kind of to reemphasize that it wasn't all friends. So there's do you know the journal of I think it's John Woolman?
I know John Woolman. I don't know the journal.
Okay, so he wrote a journal, and it's just basically things that he was doing during his life. Uh, and he was an abolitionist in the 1750s, I think 1760s, somewhere around then. And a lot of walking around in the colonies and stuff like that, and joining other meetings and stuff. And he just goes through a lot of this. Is that a lot of Quakers owned slaves, and but some of them were not didn't sit easy with them, but he was very much against it, and he would prepare people's wills and things like that, and he would convince them during the preparation of their will to get to free their slaves, so things like that. So he had an impression from God telling him, let help this community stop doing this. It's a poor reflection of Christ's action in the world. He also has some really interesting things that are also way ahead of its time, I think, which is like tax resistance. Uh, because there was a war going on at the time, the French Indian War, I think, is what he's referring to. I may have the dates wrong or something, but uh, this is something they talked about where they're like, well, we're paying taxes, and these taxes are going to fund this war, and this doesn't sit easy with us that like we're funding people killing each other. Like, what do we do about that? And one of the solutions was to live very modestly and reduce the amount of luxuries and stuff like that that you had, because then you would be um, if you're generating less income, or if you're buying less luxuries, and that's what the taxes are on, then uh, you are not funding it as much. So I think it's to, a very long way of answering this is I think that individuals do have prophetic foresight, and I think this is true amongst all believers. Um, but I think that the way that the Quaker community is structured gives early action, I think, because it takes individuals to act, and also because we have sort of a narrative theology, and so we're reading a lot about what other people are doing. That also kind of impacts our uh, our view of what's going on, I guess. So um, you read about other Quakers doing, freeing slaves, for example, then you're going to start going like, why are they doing this? Oh, yeah, maybe this is not the right thing for me to do. Or you read about other Quakers doing tax resistance, or protesting Vietnam, or uh, going and helping, starving mothers in Germany after the war, or protesting the blockade in World War I, like that sort of thing. When you read about these things, that sort of makes you think a little bit more about your journey. I think with Christ is that it's something to contemplate, especially when you're sitting quietly for a long time. That's something that could be like. So we have these things also called queries, where they're basically questions that you can ask yourself during silence to sort of maybe if you need some sort of guidance. Sometimes it's hard to just be there quietly, your mind wanders and stuff like that, so you have different things to think about. And I think these are types of things that become the queries, is like, what are we doing to stop World War II, or whatever, or the violence that's associated with that, or like these mass killings and things like that. So I think that's kind of what it is it's the structure, I think, is just gives rise to early action.
Yeah, and I'm so wow, there are a number of things. I mean, you everything you said was good, and I think biographies and seeing how other people are doing things and then applying that is good. But another one that stood out was just when you said, "What can we do about these mass killings?" I'm thinking you actually have the presumption that you can do something in the world. Like for my group, by and large, it'd be like, ah, man, what can I do about these mass killings? I mean, there's nothing I can do until 3 more years when I can vote for the president again, because we invest everything into politics and everything is structural and hierarchical and it's out of my control. Like we don't view, for as individualistic as we are, I we don't think that individuals really do anything, and I think that's impressive. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think this is, at least for me, is, I mean, this is, you are acting in the world with the light of Christ. So this is the creative force of the universe, or whatever, is expressed through the individual. So you do have the ability to change things, even if it's a small amount. You can still impact the homeless guy on the street or something like that. Like there are things that you can do. Um, One of the things that I work in a lot, which is not really Quaker associated, is the libertarian anarchist community, I guess. And it is community building. This is something that I think our world is missing, is community. And so it's a sickness in our society, is that people don't have people that they can rely on. And so this is where I think I can make an impact, and where it may be a small impact is one of these people that kind of comes in and can help form a community with me. Maybe one of them can impact stopping these mass killings. Uh, as far as like voting every couple of years or whatever, not all Quakers agree with this, but democracy is going to leave people unhappy. It's that it doesn't work. That's why we use harmony in meeting, is that we don't vote on stuff. We come to an agreement that everybody can move forward with, inspired by Christ. Because if you just vote on everything, there's always going to be the minority vote that is not happy with the situation. A compromise in democracy is some people don't get anything, and some people get what they want. Like that's how a compromise works. So that sort of I think that's maybe another thing, is that um, even if you can't get collective action on something, you can still take individual action, and individual action does impact stuff. I mean, there's uh, albeit could be small, but if you're trying to save one life, you have one life, and you can maybe save one to one. It's mass killings is a hard way to think about it, because you're thinking you're in this mass group of people, and you're trying to stop this mass group of people, but maybe you can save one. And that's all that all I mean that's if Christ is calling you to do that, then do that. So I think that's maybe, I guess, a different way of thinking about it is the voting thing. I mean, I don't think voting matters matters at all. I mean, like, it to me, it's. I also, this is more of a personal opinion, and and Quakers actually did take. They had a lot of political power in the late 1700s, especially in like Pennsylvania and Maryland and places like that, in North Carolina, um, and this is another one where they sort of collectively made an early decision to not hold political power, because it's ultimately backed up by violence, and I think a lot of modern Quakers don't believe in that. And I think that a lot of past Quakers didn't, but they did sort of en masse resign from political seats in the colonies right prior to the United States becoming the United States, uh, and it was a kind of a collective realization that ultimately all action by the government is backed up by the sword, and uh, that if you are wielding that power, you're violent, and if you're voting for somebody to wield that power, you're putting them in the position to live a life of sin and wield that power and hurt others and that sort of stuff. So there's a um, I don't know. I don't know how I got off on this other tangent, but it's just sort of a weird, like, this is more of a my personal thing. I don't think there's a huge amount of Quakers that necessarily believe in this, but there are a lot of tax resistors, because funding the police or funding jails or funding wars is antithetical to the testimonies. There are plenty of anarchists. Usually, they're left anarchists that are in Quakerism. I would probably call myself a right anarchist, but the end result. Um, I mean, getting rid of a violent state is kind of the goal. We just have kind of different views on what that would mean, but uh, there are these forces active in the Quaker community, but they're, I would say, minor. I think probably most conservative Quakers would actually probably be Democrats and be pushing for those sort of democratic policies that uh, contain that perspective of social justice and things like that. That is, again, a kind of a point of contention with some people, is that the political side does tend to be very left leaning as far as the American political structure left. That's why liberal and conservative in the Quaker sense don't mean liberal and conservative in the American political sense. Um, it's more about Christianity. I think it's more like conservative and traditional. Conservative would be more traditional Quakers, and liberals would be a little bit more modern in their, I guess, theology is like non-Christ centered is the only way I can think about it. And then again, evangelicals are more Christ centered, but they are more like other Protestants where they have programmed structure. But I don't know how I got off on this on this whole tangent, but uh, yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. Is that, yeah, there's definitely a reinforced belief that you can take action and you can make a difference. Whether the size is not relevant, it's that, yes, Christ is compelling you to do this. You do this, and I can't remember her name, but there was a friend, a woman who got kicked out of the Massachusetts colony, and but she felt that Christ was still calling her back, and they told her, "If you come back, we'll kill you." Um, and She felt like she was supposed to come back, and she did, and they did end up killing her. So, like, and that's very tragic and stuff like that. But it made an impact on the theological narrative, I guess, of she. I mean, this is the same as to me as being a martyr back in just right after Christ was resurrected. Is it's sort of the same thing. It's that you are here to um, tell a group of people that uh, they need to change their ways, and uh, so she died, but she made a huge impact because we still read about her today. Um, we still have a better understanding of the truth of Christ in this world based on those actions in the past. So even if you don't feel like you're making an impact, you can make an impact. It's just may not be immediately apparent.
Yeah, one of the other things that you talked about, I mean, you talked about it a bunch here, is the silence, and um, it sort of it struck me. I remember when I was talking for the last episode, and it was said that, well, part of the silence is we reflect on what other people have said, but also we are inviting God to speak to us. And this shows you just how messed up I am. And that I was like, oh yeah, I guess you would want to hear from God. But the way that a lot of evangelicalism is, and I understand that we talk about prayer, but a lot of times when I think of a decision, making a decision like in a meeting, I'm not I'm not thinking of inviting God, like to really, really listen to God. I might pray about it and kind of have this sentiment that, yeah, I care what God thinks. But a lot of times I think it's more of, well, I know what God thinks. He thinks like me. And because I want this thing, and I would only want it if it's what God wanted. So this must be what God wants. But taking that time to pause and really, really reflect and let God speak, I was like, oh, that really does make a lot of sense. And I think in evangelicalism, some of our things, and it's probably different in the charismatic community, but we're kind of averse. Like we believe in the Holy Spirit, but we really don't like him very much. We don't. It's uncomfortable because I'm learning, reading a lot on this recently, but learning that I think a lot of modern day evangelicalism is really just rationalistic empiricist types of things, a response to the late 19th century, and we don't think we're like them, but we really really are. Like we're very rationalistic, and I think this is just one example of where that does us a disservice in being able to make decisions as a community and try to listen to God and assume that God might not have the same desires and conclusions that we do.
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, it's not easy either. I mean, it takes a long time to make decisions in harmony with the rest of the meeting. It's not easy. Kind of the way that it works in conservative business meeting is you have the people that participate in business meeting, which is anybody who's convinced and is part of that meeting. And you'll have some sort of decision to make. And there's usually somebody who it rotates who it is, but there's somebody usually who's kind of in charge of the meeting, and uh, they'll basically people will make their statements or whatever, and then they'll call for silence, and then we'll try to kind of discuss it some more and see what's going on. And but there's a lot of one of the things that I think is really nice about doing it this way is that not everybody has all of the knowledge. So everybody else may have different bits of knowledge and stuff like that. So you could have something very simple like installing an air conditioner. This is something that happened at my meeting. Installing an air conditioning at the meeting. So we lived in Virginia. It's very hot. And there's no air conditioning in our meeting house. We just had fans, but the fans worked pretty well. But uh, some people wanted an air conditioning installed, and that would have used meeting money. And then that money so you can only use money for one thing at a time, right? So you could buy an air conditioning, or you could complete the landscaping, or you could help the poor at the beach. And and there was a lot of homeless people at the beach, and that was one thing that we did outreach for. So there's a lot of different things you can do, and then it further complicates is that, well, where does the air conditioning come from? Was child labor used to build this air conditioning? Was it voluntary child labor, or was it slave labor, or um, you know were the rare earth metals in the air conditioning, did they come from child mines in Africa where these kids are basically slaves? So there's a lot of more complicated things to think about when talking about just buying an air conditioning, or what color to paint the meeting, or what carpet to use. Like there are other things that are involved in that, and so that's why these things sort of take a long time, because what is what's important to you, uh, you may be able to get that thing that is important to you, but there are other implications involved that you may not think about. And so taking time to go in silence and have Christ, and Christ does act differently in different people. So have Christ touch the hearts of different people who are involved in the meeting to bring up points that you may not have thought about. Um, or to bring up, a point that, like, maybe you shouldn't be getting an air conditioning. Maybe it's fine the way it is. I mean, the meeting has been there since the 1800s, and nobody ever had an air conditioning. Fans were relatively new, so um, you just don't necessarily need that, and there may be a higher priority for the meeting's money. Additionally, there may be somebody in the meeting who is perfectly willing to volunteer to just buy an air conditioning and install it. So uh, and they take individual action on that and install it. And then you've got air conditioning because that's what they wanted in the meeting, and it makes the meeting more comfortable for them, and it makes it more welcoming to people who are maybe not believers, because it's cool, and gets up in the 90s and it's humid, and it's Virginia, so um, there's a lot of things that kind of go into that, and so trying to achieve harmony, not just harmony with the meeting, but harmony with Christ, to make a decision, it takes work. It's not easy. It's like being married is not always the easiest thing in the world. It is an effort on a daily basis to make sure that you are moving together as a couple, to some sort of single vision or something. But and it's sort of the same thing with a meeting, is that Christ used these analogies in the Bible all the time about the groom and the brides and stuff like that. That's what the church is. It's a marriage, and marriage is work, and we're preparing the world for Christ to come into the world. So it's it's an effort, but I think it's a noble effort, and I think that it does, and I think this is what kind of leads back to that. Why are Quakers sort of ahead of their time? Although it does seem like it takes a long time for action, those collective actions do tend to be, um, I think, a better reflection of Christ's action in the world. Sometimes they're not. I mean, there have been plenty of Quakers that probably did not do the right things, and plenty of meetings who made wrong decisions and stuff like that. But because people's egos, they're just people. But I think that's sort of what it sort of condenses it and lends itself to, and that's why you see a lot of this very, very small, peculiar group of people making very large impacts in the world.
And I guess if it takes a while for Quakers to make a decision, but once they do make a decision, because it has the full force of the community behind it, they do it with conviction and you know a certainty of sorts.
Yeah, yeah, and like your example that you did, I think 2 episodes ago, Benjamin Lay, he was not popular. Like it took a long time, I mean, after his death, even before really the entire community joined him. And there was declarations. The Quakers and the Mennonites got along really well early on in the American colonies. There were declarations with the Mennonites and the Quakers to abolish slavery. The famous one was in Germantown. I think it was in the late 1600s, even, where they were saying we're not doing slavery anymore. So there were people actively working on it, but it took almost 100 years before the more holistic sort of total group said, we're not doing this anymore. We're freeing our slaves and we're moving forward to be abolitionists as a group. So it does take a long time. But it was still, although it was 100 years after, they were kind of pushing this. But I mean, like George Fox, who's kind of the founder, um, he was against slavery. So even, I mean, from the 1650s until the late 1700s, there were people actively changing the community and getting them to kind of coalesce around this abolitionist sentiment. And they did achieve it 100 years prior to the Civil War, but uh, it still took a long time. So that's kind of like, it's like, I don't like to poo poo them being, I guess, advanced as far as morality, but it's not like it's like a magic like switch or anything like that. It takes a long time for people's hearts and minds to be changed. But it's done in harmony, and like you said, once that's done in harmony and people are convinced, they can move forward as a force together. And in the meantime, people take individual action.
And I mean they do it right too, or at least it's you can poo poo this too, but it like I look at my community right now, and we're facing so much pushback trying to do like racial reconciliation stuff or talk about race. Like they don't want to hear it. We're done with that. And I think about the Quakers. It's like, well, when they did realize that there was a major problem, they did say, you know what, slaves are human. They are image bearers of God. Um, Not only did they release their slaves, but they advocated compensating them and like restore it, like restoration, repentance. And I think about my group, my denomination that I'm in right now. Like they really only put out an apology at the like higher level about turning away blacks in the 60s. They only released that like a couple years ago, or a decade ago maybe. And and we're still so averse to it. We don't want to look at our sin or the consequences of that. Whereas it seems like, yeah, when the Quakers make a decision, they're like they're all in. It might take them 100 years to do it, but and they're behind it.
Yeah, I mean it does. I think it's because it's like I said, it is something that you you are given a lot of time to contemplate, and you're given a lot of time to open your heart to Christ. Um, one of the things that when I became an early convinced friend that I used to always really promote about it, I really think people receive too many messages. Uh, like your phone is always buzzing. Just hearing this conversation, I'm getting messages from work. Like I receive messages all day long. The radio's on. I got podcasts, the television. Then when I was in the evangelical community, then on Sunday, I go to church. I receive a message from the priest or the preacher. So it's just like you're always receiving these messages. Your mind is I think cluttered by a lot of these external sources of information, which are good. I mean, you should be receiving that as well. But um, it, and then when you're praying, a lot of times you're asking for things. You're not receptive to receiving information. So your entire life you're receiving all this external stuff, and then in the rare moments where you're quiet and praying, you're asking for stuff, so you're giving the message. So there's very little time for you to just quietly listen for God. And I think aside from the religious point, I think that it's just really good for people to be quiet for a little while. In for thousands and thousands of years, people were often sitting there quietly with nothing going on around them, watching their sheep or chopping trees or whatever the heck they're doing. Uh, and now we just have so much of this stuff going on that taking a break and intentionally waiting for Christ to minister to you, I or content, or even if you're not open for that at that moment, thinking about the things that are going on in the world or in your life or whatever quietly for a little while without somebody else telling you what to think about it.
So this is probably going to be a really stupid question, but how? So I know you talk about community helping you discern the voice of Christ, but it seems so to an evangelical Westerner, it seems so subjective and just I'm just quiet and like don't think of anything, and like how do I know that the voice that comes to me isn't my voice? How do I know that it's the voice of God? I like how do you do it, and how do you discern?
Yeah. Well, it's a little bit, it is a little bit kind of like mystical, I guess, and it does feel different. So I'm sure people who are really into meditation and stuff like that, and I think it's similar to that. Is that um, you may not be ready or open to hearing Christ, but you could be, um, I guess, influenced in just sort of like dissecting the things that happened in your life. So, like conscience, I think, is an expression of the spirit. So, if you are sitting in a meeting and maybe all week long you haven't thought about this at all, but you were mean to somebody, you said something mean to them or whatever, and then that kind of like pops into your head, like, oh yeah, I was really rude to this cashier or something like that. Uh, I think that like that conscience or feeling bad about it, or just it coming up in your head is sort of um, is the types of things that would be like very simple things to hear about. But um, also though, um, you're all sitting in community together, and so somebody may be inspired uh, by the Spirit, or they will feel like they're inspired by the Spirit to bring something up. And sometimes it's kind of weird. Like sometimes they'll, like I remember this one time, and I don't know what the message was, but maybe it was for somebody else. This guy stood up in a meeting, and he was like, we were walking, my wife and I were walking, and we passed by these bushes, and they usually bloom in April, but it's February and they were blooming, and I just thought, it's not time for them to bloom. And that was all he said. So, and it was weird. And like, I was like, I don't know what that means, but maybe that meant something to somebody there. Maybe it meant something to him. So it's those types of things, is that we are open to receiving God. And then if you feel especially convicted, then that is something you would either bring up or that you would discuss with other people in the meeting afterward, because we do usually fellowship afterward. And so, and that's sort of how you use, I guess, the community. But it is a little bit hard to describe. Like the easiest way, the most relatable way I can think of describing it is conscience. Is that you will have something that doesn't seem internal to you, that impacts your conscience. And I would say that's the closest thing as I can think of to describe the Spirit, is that um, things are going to be happening in your life, and you may push them aside and not think about them. And then you have this, couple of hour period to uh, sort of clear your mind and think. And then the things that come up and the things that you feel impacted by are going to be the things that are Christ speaking to you. But it's also, sometimes you go for an entire meeting, it's very difficult to clear your mind. Maybe you get like a couple of seconds or something, and there's minor clarity, because I mean, like a lot of times I'll sit there and I'll be thinking about programming, or I'll be thinking about what I'm going to prepare for the podcast, or uh, a TV show, or whatever, like things, other things pop in your mind. But it's a practice. It's something that, and people who meditate will kind of have this a very similar um, a similar thing, where it's like it takes time. It's something that you need to be ready for, that, and that you're practicing to be receptive to this. So I don't know if that answers your question at all. It is a little bit mystical. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think that the mystical is a bad thing. It's something that is harder for me and my group to understand, and I think value as legitimate. When I think most of the time groups tend to go to extremes, and so I think our group definitely needs more mystical, and maybe, I don't know, maybe your group needs more empirical, or I don't know, but I know that my group needs more mystical. um,
I mean, the nature of God is supernatural. So it's like, you know, there is, so, and these are different impressions and stuff that I get in my community. Like, I do come from, I think, that more kind of legalistic tradition and stuff, and there was a lot of stuff like that this was just so hippie to me, like way too, like when I first got into it, it was kind of a turn off, but there was something about it.
and you said you're a programmer.
Yeah, I'm a software engineer. Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
yeah, I would not have associated that. I
Yeah.
was thinking like hippie type stuff too.
Oh yeah, no, I'm a software engineer, but like when I first went there, like it was also like it was sort of an opportune time, because like things were not going great for me. Well, I would say objectively things were going pretty well for me in my life, but like spiritually and emotionally they were not. And um, my dad's actually in the military, so he got stationed somewhere else, and so I have four sisters. They all moved to this other place, and I was still in Virginia alone for the first time in a long time, being from a big family. Um, and like just a lot of things like that were going on, where I was just like, it was kind of a confusing time. I was also, reading Tolstoy. I was also starting to get into the anarchist stuff, and the like I felt very impacted by uh, the way that our church was promoting war, to me at least, is, you go in, there's the pulpit, and you have a big old American flag, the Christian flag, on the same level, and then below those the cross. And like there was just, to me, there was just this kind of like symbolism of like the state, and like, and then the amount of like God bless, George Bush, and like like all of these types of things, where I was just like, this is, I don't, I like, it's not, there's something wrong about this. Like, they were, the Iraq war by that time had been going on forever. I was starting to also, I was into both of those things as a young person, going like, oh yeah, this is great, this is what, America's supposed to do, and also associate that with the religion. So like, this is, us bringing democracy to the world, and that's going to like promote them from being heathens and like coming over to Christ and all that sort of stuff. But like, those things were starting to kind of change in my mind. And then that, so I went to the Quaker meeting, and it was full of hippies, like just a bunch of weirdos, a bunch of Buddhists, and atheists, and like all sorts of people that I would not associate with it. And so like, I didn't feel good about it. But going in and sitting quietly for a while and being able to think about something, there was something to that. And then over time, uh, I was less uncomfortable with like the weird hippie stuff. I understood then why there were Buddhists there. I understood why atheists were there. Um, and I felt a lot less adversarial to, I felt much less like these different people that didn't believe what I believed were my enemies, and that they were more people that, were just at a different stage of spiritual development, and they may be more advanced in spiritual development in some areas and less in other areas. But that was the point of the meeting, was to make a space for everybody to come to Christ. And so like, that was sort of like an interesting transformation. And I think the main thing that transformed was being able to be quiet and not have all of these external messages and stuff like that going for, and it's just good for you, I think, in general, is to sit quietly and not have your phone buzzing or people messaging you on Teams or whatever. So I just think there is a need for that in the world, and it's sometimes hard to, sitting quietly and sitting still is hard. It especially nowadays, I think. But I think people need it.
Quick question for you: how much time do you have? Because I want to make sure that I get to some of these questions, and I don't want
Oh,
to.
that I got plenty of time. I got work to do, but I can do it later.
Okay,
So
perfect. So yeah, then I won't worry about it.
okay.
Um, okay, one of the questions that I want to get to next, because some of the things that you're talking about, like just sitting in silence, and you don't do music in
No.
or
Um,
preaching or
no, there's
or
well,
evangelism.
no, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say there is no preaching, but we believe that all believers are ministers, and so if you're compelled by Christ to speak, you can.
Okay, so I want to tie this to one of the things that probably the major tipping point for me to come to nonviolence was looking at the early church. I'm like, oh
Hmm.
man, they look very, very different than we do. And the early church, just like the Quakers, it's not like everything the early church did was perfect and wonderful, and it's this panacea for all of my Christian woes.
Sure.
But when you see them univocal on certain issues or practices, it should make you think twice, I think.
Mhm.
So could you help me understand what is the Quaker relation to the early church? Because in my mind, it seems like some of the Quaker practices are and ideas are way better than my groups. Like their adherence to nonviolence, their orthopraxy, not just trying to caring about what they do, not just what they
Mhm.
think. I think they get that right better than my group tends to do. But some of these practical aspects of not preaching, well, it seems like Paul and others, like it seems like there was preaching, or it seems like there were prophecies in the church, people speaking. It seems like there
Mhm.
were songs and hymns. um, and so could you kind of talk about where you think Quakerism lines up with the early church, where it diverges, where
Yeah. Well, so I think that early on, so I mean, Quakerism is a product of the time that it came out of. And so there was these people called Seekers in England. This is during the English Civil War when Cromwell took over, and they were all trying to like figure out like what God wanted. And you got a lot of different denominations that came out of this. And so I think a lot of the stuff that is traditional with Quakers is sort of a product of that time, but they were trying to go back to their understanding of what the early church was. So this much more flat communal sort of structure. So just we don't have priests or preachers, but it's not because, well, that's not the right way to say it. We do have them, but everybody is that. So people do feel, but I guess this is the other aspect of that, is that it's like a solemn responsibility to get up and speak in meetings. So you should be sure that the message that you're bringing is Christ inspiring you to speak. Um, so people do stand up, and sometimes people stand up and sing. Like, that happens once in a while too. They just feel like they feel like this song is pouring out of them, and that they need to stand up and sing, and then they do, and then they sit down, and the meeting continues until people shake hands, and at some point somebody will feel like the meeting is done, and shake hands, and then that spreads, and then people leave. But you're also welcome to just continue to sit there. But so the music aspect of that is kind of interesting, because there was a sort of a little fight about that at some point. I don't remember exactly the deal with it. So the way that like our meeting in Virginia dealt with it is that if you really wanted to, like, I really like Christmas music a lot. I grew up in the church. I like singing the Christmas hymns. I like listening to those. If you felt like that was something that you wanted and that was missing, we didn't do it at our meeting, but there was a nearby. There was, I think, it was an Episcopal church, and they did those, and so we would just as a group go there and fellowship with other Christians that have a different practice, and we would participate in their hymns because we liked them. Uh, and some that didn't work for them, so they just didn't participate, and that was fine. So as far as like, I think it's to some degree a little bit difficult to know exactly what the early church was doing, but I think a lot of this is designed to try to mimic this sort of small community, um, harmony in the community, and uh, individual action. So we do have preachers. I mean, George Fox, the founder, he preached. I mean, like, he went around and told people, "This is what I believe. We should be listening for Christ." John Woolman walked around, and a lot of it is a lot of it's more, instead of like somebody up high preaching down, it's more conversational. So I think that's kind of a little bit of the difference. And we also still do epistles, so writing to other meetings. So like my meeting in Virginia Beach was Virginia Beach Friends meeting. It was part of North Carolina yearly meeting. So this is also a little bit different for conservatives. Is conservatives don't have like a convention. So like Friends general meeting is, I think it's liberal, and then there's like the Evangelical Friends conference, and I think there's a couple of those as well. Uh, so conservatives are organized slightly differently. They have the weekly meetings and then the monthly meetings, and then the monthly meetings are part of the yearly meetings. And there's three main yearly meetings in the United States. I think it's Iowa, Ohio. I think Ohio is the biggest, and then North Carolina, which is the one that I was part of. And so they're not really a hierarchical structure exactly, but those are the yearly meetings. They get together, they try to write out the queries and epistles to the other meetings, and things for other Christians to think about, or other friends to think about, and things like that. So there is sort of that aspect that is sort of preaching, but a lot of it's done in conversation, and a lot of it's done more in writing, if that makes sense. And then the music thing, that's sort of like a, I think the music thing is more of a product of the Protestant Reformation, because a lot of the Protestants at that time were not allowing any music at all, and they were stripping down a lot of the stuff that the Catholic Church, the ornate stuff that the Catholic Church did, and doing very plain style everything. And I think a lot of that has carried over into like modern Protestantism, and the music aspect just kind of stuck with conservative friends. There's just no music. It's just part of it.
Yeah, I know certain very conservative aspects, groups in our denomination, like they'll only sing the Psalms
Right.
or something. So they don't do no singing, but yeah,
Yeah.
they're very
Yeah.
limited.
Yeah, I mean, it was in the meeting in Virginia, and we actually the meeting here that I go to once in a while in Fort Worth. It's in a church, so there are instruments and stuff like that. It's a I don't know what the denomination of the church is, but there are instruments. And in our meeting, we had an organ, like a small electric organ. Um, I had never seen it played, so I'm not really sure why it was there, but it was there. So I would imagine that somebody used it at some point. And people, like I said, in meetings, some people will be filled with Christ, and they'll feel like they need to sing, and so they do. Um, it's not common, but it does happen.
Okay. Uh, Another question about the meeting and that kind of the way that you do things. Talked a bit about consensus making in the last
Hmm.
episode. So I don't think really need to kind of go into details unless there's anything you'd want to fill in.
Hmm.
But one of the questions that I had was, so let's say I'm on my church's diaconate, and we're helping somebody who comes in with a need,
Hmm.
financial need, whatever, keep the lights on, stay in their uh, apartment, whatever, and the need is pretty immediate. One of the critiques I think that you probably get about decision making is, well, what if you just have to make a decision? Um, and I think most of the time, decisions don't actually have to be made with immediacy when people
Yeah.
think that they do.
Right.
In most of the mercy needs that's occurred, part of the reason people come with this story of immediacy is because they know that it puts you on edge and it makes you make your decision fast, and
Hmm.
it makes their decision more weighty. But let's just assume there really is a decision that has to
Sure.
be done immediately. How do you work through that?
Well, I mean, the meeting usually it just takes too long for the meeting to do it. So somebody or a group of somebodies will take immediate action. So, um, like one example of this was when Obamacare got passed. Uh, this is something that was controversial, I guess, with our members, and a lot of the members wanted to go help people sign up for this at different places. And that is sort of an immediate thing because there is a time limit to when you can enter the marketplace and all that sort of stuff and get insurance. And others said, no, we shouldn't participate in this because this is force. Um, and that would be the side that I was kind of on. And but so instead of trying to figure this out for months and months, and then the deadline passes, um, a group of people got together and they said, okay, well, you know what, we're just going to take time out of our lives and volunteer and go do this. And so the same thing is if like somebody, needed to keep the lights on or whatever, and there was some sort of immediate need for that, you would you could take up a collection that was separate from the meetings money. You could, if somebody had like a burst pipe or something, maybe we have a plumber or somebody who's a handyman in the meeting, and they can go help free of charge or something like that. So you can take individual action. It's just that that corporately it takes a long time for action to reach harmony. So it's just it encourages. One of the things I bring this up a lot is that when I was a kid, um, this used to happen all the time in our church. Is that my mom was very involved in the youth ministry for like little kids, and time and time again, she would not volunteer for something, and everybody would just assume that she was going to do it. So the and that was sort of the church consensus that that the leadership of the church was just like, oh well, Marta will do it. Um, and I think that was uh, incorrect, and it was not fair. I don't think to my mom, and it wasn't really fair to our family either. She's got a bunch of kids of her own, but she always felt like she needed to do that. Whereas I think in Quaker meeting, because sort of hierarchical action of the church, there's not really that structure to take action, and harmony reaching takes a long time, and so it gives people more of a free space to say yes or no on an individual level. So that like there is youth ministry that we didn't have very many kids at our meeting because the average age of the meeting was like 70, but um, there were some kids, and so the people who would make sure to do that, like they either took action on their own to say, yes, I'm going to do this, or no, I'm not going to do this. So there was a lot less assumptions that so-and-so member was going to do this, or it was more of a, people felt much more comfortable saying yes or no, or saying, I'm going to do this. Does anybody want to help me? Because there's that kind of, there's that sort of like, you have no ability to defer this to some leadership structure. It's all going to come down to basically you doing it or not doing it. So I think that's kind of the, I hope that answers your question.
No, it's
Yeah.
brilliant because next week actually I'm talking with somebody about the diffusion of responsibility. I'm going to use
Yeah.
Tolstoy as well, and the
Yeah.
diffusion of responsibility in the sense of there are a number of ways that that happens. One way is that you can diffuse it negatively, like where the government says, well, we have the right to kill people, but the police officer arrests, the attorney, the prosecutor convicts, the judge condemns, the
Yeah.
jury, and so you kind of diffuse it that way. But then the other way is like voting. Well, I
Yeah.
voted, I kind of did my part, I gave the government my responsibility. Now I don't have any,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
even though I recognize that, I until you brought that up, I was like, oh yeah, I guess as a deacon, if our church couldn't come to a conclusion, I could have done something,
Sure.
for the person on my own, but because I'm so invested in hierarchy and structure and that sort of thinking, it it's a secondary thought. It wasn't even a second.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and this came up for me a lot at the beginning too. When I first became convinced, was it's kind of difficult to wrap your head around a very flat structure when you're just, nothing else in your life is like that. There's like one of the very first things that somebody said, that it's sort of a like there's a lot of curmudgeons in the meeting or whatever, and somebody said, like yelled across the room at somebody. I was talking to him about like just Christianity and stuff and Jesus, and he yelled across the room at this other lady, and he said, "Hey, Jesus loves you," and her response was, "Says who?" And which I just thought was kind of like interesting and funny, but also it's kind of like, oh, well, this is sort of a, this is, to me, this was more like an invitation to discuss, like it, rather than like a curmudgeonly like brushing it off kind of thing. Is that like there is sort of this, you don't, you don't really have a pastor to go to ask if something's wrong or right. You have to discern that for yourself. You can corporately decide a lot of that stuff and talk to people in the meeting, and they can help you arrive at a conclusion. And then also, since there's no expectation that the deacons and the pastor are going to handle some situation, it's just so much more up to you to make sure that things that you are convicted to make sure happen. Like you don't, it's up to you. You have to do it. So and then what's, I think is good about that too, is that because everybody has this expectation, and then it's much easier to form smaller groups to go and do something that you all feel that this is a good thing together. So it doesn't end up getting deferred to like one person. Like my mom's not running Vacation Bible School every single year for 10 years. It's now a group of people are getting together and going, oh, well, this is something we can offer to the community. It's something that we care about. Um, and then also it also gives room for the person to say, I did handle this last year, but I just don't have time to do it this year, or I feel compelled by Christ to do something else. Um, and then somebody else can step up. So it kind of gives that, it sort of gives the negative expectation as well as the positive expectation. So you can you can feel more comfortable saying no, and you can feel more comfortable saying yes, I guess is the best way I can describe it.
No, that's extremely helpful, and it's something that I think I can see it when you say it, but I think for most people in my group would require a paradigm shift because I've been saturated like with examples and I've
Yeah.
heard bits and pieces, so it makes sense, but I understand why it doesn't make sense to people in my
Yeah.
group because I still think that way.
Well, and I do too. A lot of times is it's I mean, any sort of, I mean, everything pretty much in our lives is structured in this sort of like pyramid fashion. And when you're looking at something that's a lot more flat, it does take a bit of a mind change to like understand how that's going to work. And it's different. It's just but once, and it can be very disorienting or very upsetting, I guess, like where you're just like, oh, nobody's going to do this, and then eventually you realize, oh, this is important to me. Like I need to do this, and it's like it is, it's just it's just a different way of thinking, kind of.
Yeah, yeah, and that's I've been going down the anarchist route as
Hmm.
well, kind of drawing out conclusions that you've drawn out here on hierarchies, but also on violence. I mean, being inherent in the
Hmm.
state. So it's and that's something that I struggled with as I looked at the Quakers because they do seem to be by and large politically involved today,
Hmm.
and so that was going to be one of my questions, but you've kind of answered that about
Yeah.
how do you deal with hierarchies in the government and other sorts of things, and I know your
Yeah.
your answer pretty much, so we don't need to go
Yeah.
into that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, okay, I think this is the last question I have
Sure.
kind of written down, and maybe some more will come from it. But one of the themes that comes out to me with the Quakers is over and over again is sacrifice. So whether it's lay being willing to sacrifice, reputation or whatever, like being willing to count the cost for the initiatives that they do, the things that they're convicted about. But
Hmm.
then even beyond, well, and other Quakers being persecuted for not paying taxes or for not joining the army back in the day,
Hmm.
or for being friends with Indians,
Yep.
Native Americans. So there's a cost that comes from persecution, but something that for I don't want to say that I'd be able to be persecuted and stand. I think I would.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Sure. Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. I think that. Hmm. So sacrifice a lot of times is a perspective. So especially with conservatives, there is a large group of what are called plain Quakers, and they're often mistaken for Amish or Mennonites. They live extremely simple lives. They make their own clothes. They have they a lot of times they receive government, or they're eligible to receive government benefits, but they do this because they don't want to basically feed into the war machine, or there's other reasons as well. They want the simplicity so that they can concentrate on the message from Christ and things like that. So, but I think that if you spoke to a lot of them, they would say, "Well, yeah, I guess giving up a lot of these, modern convenience and stuff like that is sacrifice." But it's a perspective. It's that for them, this is what they want to do, and uh, in a lot of ways, it's a privilege to live that way. So, um, I think that's sort of part of it, is that personal sacrifice is. I mean, you can see like my house. I'm speaking in a microphone. I got computers and stuff like that. Like there's uh, if you feel convicted to give up a lot of these things, then you would. Then you would. And even like John Woolman, for example, like he talks about this in his journal a lot, where he gives up a lot of conveniences and luxuries because the same thing is he doesn't want to fund slavery and he doesn't want to fund war. So he lives a very, very simple life. But what I always find very inspiring about his journal is that he keeps doing these things to give up wealth or conveniences and stuff like that, and he keeps getting blessed with good business decisions. So he every time he gives up some money, he receives more money. So it's like a weird like prosperity gospel kind of thing, I guess. But but like he does, it's a very strange kind of situation, and you see this a lot um, in Quakers in history. Is a lot of them did give up stuff and then became extremely wealthy business people and things like that because they adhered to what they believed were the teachings of God, and God rewards uh, living, in His light. And so, like, I'm the Cadbury Cream Egg, or the Cadbury Company, the chocolate company. That's a Quaker company, or they were back a long time ago. Um, and the one of the first patents issued in the United States was for straw hats, like a machine that made these straw hats. This was a woman. She invented this, and she became extremely wealthy from that. She was a Quaker. So it's like these different like things that when you live in the light of Christ, a lot of times you're rewarded, and it may not be just financially rewarded. It may just be peace of spirit. And I think that a lot of plain Quakers, that's sort of how they express their experience of God, is that although it does seem like a large personal sacrifice to live in a very, very plain manner, um, it's also it's sort of like the monastic movement, like going off into the desert and living that way. Like that is a privilege as well to some degree, because although you may not be comfortable physically, spiritually you are satisfied and full. So I guess that's kind of the trade off. And then as far as like being persecuted throughout history, uh, I'm sure it was not pleasant at all, at all in history, but it's fun to read about. It's very interesting to read about. One of the stories that is always one of my favorites is that when Cromwell took over England, there was a law that you had to go to church, and Quakers don't go to church; they go to meeting. And so Cromwell was all, or it wasn't Cromwell specifically, but the Puritans that were in charge were all angry about this, that Quakers kept not going. And so their favorite way to punish them was to strip them naked and like march them around the town, right? As like a way to embarrass them. And so the Quaker response to this was, well, if you really want us to go to church and you really want us naked, we'll just go to church naked. And so they would just show up in church with no clothes on, and like, what do you do about that? Like it's things like that where they a lot of times find a very clever way, or a um, sort of a joyful way to resist, even if it's not physically pleasant, um, or there is a lot of pain and physical discomfort and stuff like that. But there is spiritual comfort, and there's a reward for, there is a like a psychological spiritual reward for doing what's right, even if it's not a even if it's not a comfortable physical situation, I guess would be the difference. I can't really think of another way to describe it. Is again, there is sacrifice, but the when you sacrifice, the reward for sacrificing spiritually is better, and oftentimes you'll be blessed with physical comforts as well. I mean, the Cadbury people were, I'm sure, very comfortable, and same thing with the lady. I can't remember her name. She's written essays and stuff. It's pretty interesting, but she made quite a bit of money for the machine that makes straw hats. And uh, there's a lot of really interesting things like that, where you can point and say that these people were, like John Woolman is a good example. Um, like materially poor but spiritually wealthy, and wealthy in friendships, and wealthy in um, his experience. He was it wasn't super common back then that you were able to just kind of go around to all the colonies and stuff like that. And he was able to meet lots of different people. He was able to interact with the Indians, and he was able to free slaves and change the material conditions of many, many people, which is it's rewarding in a different way. Whereas, so yes, his physical comfort was, I guess, a sacrifice, but it's made up in another way. I think that's the way, I guess, I'll answer the question.
Yeah, yeah, and that just brings in another thing for me, which is, Cromwell, right? The
Mhm.
Puritans um, persecuting the Quakers, and you said in Boston, was it, where that lady came back and they hung her
Yeah,
because she,
it was Massachusetts. I don't know if it was specifically
Massachusetts?
Boston, but yeah,
Yeah, Puritans executing Quakers who like don't do anything to anybody, and it
yeah,
you know, we, my group has this narrative that, oh, the poor Puritans escaping persecution, and really what it amounts to a lot of times, in my mind at least, maybe this is too far the other way, but It's basically, well, you're escaping the powerlessness that you had, because had you had the power, you would have been persecuting the other people.
Yeah.
You're mad
Well,
that you can be persecuting people.
yeah, I mean, they're very interesting people, especially the American Puritans were kind of like the Puritans that the Puritans didn't like. And so they kicked him out to America. Well, first to Holland, then to the colonies. But yeah, it's a really interesting time. I mean, even Cromwell. Um, there's a lot of interaction between George Fox and Cromwell. Cromwell would visit him in jail a lot of times, and he would leave. And one of the quotes that George Fox used to say, he'd say, like, "I implore you to leave your crown at God's feet." Basically, give up the power. Uh, stop doing what you're doing. And he would leave the meetings crying and touched by George Fox's words, but would ultimately just go back to doing what he was doing. Um, so it was a really interesting time. And this is, George Fox was, you can talk about sacrifice. George Fox was a fairly wealthy middle class man, um, was convicted by Christ to start a sort of a peaceful revolution in the midst of inter-Christian faith fighting. And then even when they got rid of the Catholics, then none of the Protestants could get along, and they were all fighting and killing each other and stuff like that. And there was a time actually where there were more Quakers in prison in England than Quakers out of prison in England. And so like there was again this sort of sacrifice, but like in the Bible, a lot of times they would go to prison and they would convert people, they're prisoners, and those prisoners would be convicted to release them. So like they would, so this was like one of those things that like governments have a hard time with, is when you have somebody who's really convicted in the faith. um, it's kind of hard to resist that charisma, I guess. Like when you can see the spirit pouring out of someone, it's just difficult to not be convinced by that. And so George Fox, he keeps going to prison, he keeps converting people, he keeps causing all these problems for the Puritans. So they send him to Barbados. He starts converting people in Barbados. Then he ends up like walking up, I think, to South Carolina, and then walks all the way to Massachusetts, converting people all along the way. And so although yes, he did have a lot of physical pain and a lot of discomfort materially. He did make a huge impact in the world, and he had a peace in Christ. I mean, this was kind of what he heard when he first had like a meditative worship or whatever. Was he heard the Spirit say, "None can speak to thy condition except for God." So um, that's kind of how he had this realization that, like, we don't just believe, like, we don't just say that we believe that God is here. He is here, and he'll speak to us. And so I wouldn't say that like the physical pain and stuff like that, it doesn't matter, but there's a trade-off, and the trade-off is spiritual fulfillment.
Yeah, yeah, and I know that that's another problem that I and my group has is, we're not Gnostics, but functionally we are, where
Hmm.
just kind of, I guess, reverse Gnostics, where the material really is good,
Hmm.
and the spiritual is kind of off to the side and secondary.
Yeah. Well, this is something that the Puritans really influenced Protestantism about, was that, and I think this is kind of where a lot of prosperity gospel and stuff like that comes from, is that the Puritans believed that if you were very wealthy, that was God blessing you. And so like these people that were rich were seen as being very holy people, uh, because they were materially blessed. And I don't think that that's exactly true. I don't think it's a crime to be rich, and I don't think it's a crime necessarily to be poor. Um, but the way that you use your material position in the world, um, it should be a force for good. So if you're a very wealthy person and you're using your position in the world, so Cadbury is another good example. The reason that Cadbury became as successful as it is, it used to be that people would like grind up bricks and they would mix the brick dust with the chocolate, and so what I may be mixing up two stories here, but that's one of the things that they did. But so what Cadbury, one of his things was, he said this was a violation of the integrity um, testimony, because you're lying. You're not actually giving people chocolate, and it's not good for them to eat brick dust. Um, and then also so he made pure chocolate. And then the other thing was that um, poor children couldn't afford most chocolate. It was a middle class treat, or a middle class and wealthy person's treat. And so he felt that this was something that should be brought to everybody. And so he invented a way to basically get the mix the chocolate with milk and make milk chocolate so that it would be cheaper, but it also still be a kind of a pure thing, not mixed with brick dust, so that poorer kids could still either have a mixed chocolate drink, or they could have small chocolates and still experience this physical joy from candy. And this made him extremely wealthy, but it was a risk, a business risk. You know, he had a business and he had a family to take care of, and this is not what other people were doing. This was going against the grain of the chocolate industry in England at the time, and he was ultimately rewarded. I mean, we still eat Cadbury today. It's a very different company today, but um, he was rewarded by being an extremely successful chocolatier or whatever in England. So things if you are acting in the right, they may not it may not always be very clear and apparent immediately that you're being rewarded for this, but doing what's right is, I don't want to say it's its own reward, because that sort of diminishes people's like physical pain and suffering and stuff like that. But doing what's right and doing what you're convicted to do is noble, honorable. It's a reward. It's a trade-off. It's that you are doing what's right, and this will give you peace of conscience, peace of spirit, um, even if it's costly financially or costly physically. uh, the trade-off is worth it. It's the right, it's that the only way I could describe it. It's the right thing to do. You should be doing what's right and just.
Yeah, and I think that gets into, I think a lot of times me, I focus on trying to maybe change my behavior, or to just focus on, okay, well, just endure the sacrifice, just make it a sacrifice. Whereas a lot of what I'm reading in regard to like virtue ethics is something that
Mhm.
I've come to realize is very powerful, and more of the idea that you your desires change. So you're talking about like, well, the plain Quakers, they don't really desire those things,
Yeah.
and so in a sense, it's not so much a sacrifice. And so the question isn't how do I make myself sacrifice? It's how do I make myself desire, and desires are fostered through, um, through disciplines and practices. And I think
Hmm.
that's probably why I struggle so much, because disciplines take discipline, and
Hmm.
that takes a lot of effort. And as a good American, I like the get rich quick schemes and the
Sure.
the
Yeah.
weight loss pills and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, like a discipline is a discipline. It's not always easy, but the rewards are great. I mean, and we read this a lot in the Bible and stuff like that. That like, uh, even when people a lot of times were told to like give up wealth and stuff like that in the Bible, they went often they would go away full in the spirit. So there's there's I would say maybe an equilibrium. It's like you are trading off one thing, but sometimes those things that you think are what you want and what you desire are actually not making you happy, and they're not benefiting your community at large. And it does take a shift um, in perspective. And it's hard. Like one of the things that I always struggle with like nonviolence is I'm married. Like, what would I do if somebody, this is are things I think about. Like, what would I do if somebody broke in and was threatening us with violence? It's like, so there's things like that where like when you're a single young man with no really responsibilities or anything like that, it's very easy to go like, well, just I'll jump out the window, or uh, I'll try to talk him out of it or whatever, or just whatever. But like when you add on the responsibility of like a spouse, or the dogs or whatever, I don't have any kids yet, but eventually adding on that responsibility of children, stuff like that, like those are things that are kind of are complicated. They're hard to think about, they're hard to deal with, but it's just it's part of the path. It's part of the discipline. It's part of uh, your experience of Christ on this earth. So I don't know. That's all I that's all I can say. I don't know if that's clear or poignant.
The older I get, I mean, the less clear things become. The more I learn, but the less
Yeah.
clear things become. So I,
Right.
yeah, wasn't expecting perfect clarity, just
Yeah.
more to chew on.
Yeah.
I think those are all the questions and more that I had. I don't know if there's anything you can think of that you'd like to add.
Um, no, I can't. I mean, I'd love to have another conversation if you think of anything else, but that's all I had in my notes. So
All right. Well, do you wanna plug your stuff and
sure. I mean, so I host a podcast called Tasting Anarchy. You can go to tastinganarchy.com, and it's mostly about wine and the government involvement in the alcohol industry. We do talk about other stuff too. My co-host Mason is interesting guy. We've been in the Liberty community for a long time together for 12 or 13 years. So he was actually my friend before I became a convinced friend, and is still my friend. Um, and he was, when I first met him, a Buddhist, and now he doesn't really care about that at all. So so kind of an interesting journey with him, and he's a very interesting guy, and we do talk about that kind of stuff once in a while, but mostly it's about the alcohol industry and how the government manipulates prices and stuff like that in that realm, or changes people's decisions and things like that. I also do a show called California in Exile, which I guess I would be the Californian in Exile. I live in Texas, but I'm a Californian, and that show is mostly about intentional communities. So that's kind of one of my focuses, is trying to get uh, separating from the sort of the whole war machine and violence of the state and stuff like that, and move into intentional communities. There's a really good Quaker community in North Carolina that has done that, called CeeLo. So we talk about that once in a while. It's pretty interesting. Um, Also, I do a Liberty event here in Central Texas every year called Childeberg. So you can go to childeberg.com and find out more information about that. If you want to just come out and hang out with us and enjoy other nonviolent liberty lovers, then hit us up and we'll give you more details.
all right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.